For 30 years, Marcus Colby worked his Texas farm in peace, leaving behind the blood-soaked jungles of Vietnam and the legend he became there. At 68, his calloused hands prefer the feel of soil to the cold metal of his medals, which stay locked away with the memories of the 37 Marines he saved during the Tet Offensive. But peace shatters when the Sinaloa cartel crosses the border, bringing terror to his small town. They extort local businesses, beat a young deputy senseless, and mark their territory by burning the American flag that Colby kept flying as a tribute to his fallen brothers. They believe they're sending a message to a helpless old man. They don't know that beneath his weathered farmer's hat lies the mind of the most decorated Force Recon Marine in his regiment. They don't know about the phone call he's about to make, a call that will summon warriors from across the country, men who have waited decades to repay their debt to the legend who refused to leave them behind in Da Nang. Now, as cartel violence threatens to consume his community, Colby must decide if he's willing to become the man he once was, leading a brotherhood of aging warriors in a final mission to protect the peace they fought so hard to find. Before we start this story, buckle up, get ready and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. Marcus Colby's boots crunched over frost-covered grass as dawn painted the Texas sky in streaks of amber and gold. His weathered hands gripped a thermos of black coffee, the same way he'd started every morning for the past 30 years. The distant rumble of engines drew his attention to the highway that snaked past his property. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows rolled by, their pristine finish out of place against the dusty rural backdrop. He watched them pass, his face remaining impassive even as his grip tightened on the thermos. The vehicles matched the description Sheriff Martinez had given him last week. Cartel. They were getting bolder, venturing further from the border, treating his quiet town like their new playground. A helicopter thundered overhead, and for a moment, the peaceful Texas morning dissolved. The scent of diesel and gunpowder filled his nostrils. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the distinctive pop of AK-47 fire and the screams of wounded Marines. Da Nang. The memory faded as quickly as it came, leaving him standing alone in his field, his coffee growing cold. At 68, Marcus had mastered the art of appearing ordinary. His faded jeans and work shirt concealed a body that, while no longer in its prime, remained hardened by daily farm work. The slight stoop in his walk masked decades of military bearing, and his calloused hands betrayed nothing of their skill with weapons. To his neighbors, he was simply the quiet farmer who grew the best sweet corn in 3 counties. The rising sun caught the metal of the flagpole near his house, drawing his eyes to the American flag that rippled in the morning breeze. He'd raised that flag 30 years ago when he'd first bought this land. It flew in memory of the men he'd served with, the ones who never made it home to see mornings like this. Inside his house, the phone rang. Marcus took his time walking back, letting it ring 4 times before answering. Sheriff Martinez's voice crackled through the receiver, tense and apologetic. "Marcus, they're making moves in town. Showed up at Rita's diner this morning, talking about protection money. I thought you should know." Marcus watched another black SUV roll past his property. "Appreciate the heads up, David. I've got calls into the state police, but you know how it is. Resources stretched thin, jurisdictional issues. By the time we cut through the red tape, they'll be dug in deep. You do what you need to do, Sheriff." Marcus kept his voice neutral, but his free hand had curled into a fist. "Just stay clear of it, Marcus. I know what you're capable of, but these aren't some street thug. They're organized, well-armed. They've got connections all the way back to Mexico." Marcus watched the sun climb higher over his field. "I'm just a farmer, David. Got crops to tend." After hanging up, Marcus walked to his study. The room was sparse, containing only a desk, a filing cabinet, and a photograph on the wall. The photo showed a group of young Marines, their faces streaked with mud and exhaustion, but grinning at the camera. In the center stood a younger version of himself, an M16 slung across his chest, and a radio operator's handset gripped in one hand. The morning passed in a rhythm of physical labor that helped quiet his mind. He checked irrigation lines, mended a section of fence, and inspected the early corn sprouts pushing through the soil. Around noon, the sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Deputy Jimmy Chen, fresh out of the academy and still wearing a uniform that looked too stiff, stepped out of his patrol car. The young man's face was etched with worry as he approached. "Mr. Colby, sorry to bother you. Sheriff asked me to make rounds, check on the outlying properties. Any trouble out here?" Marcus shook his head, noting the way the deputy's hand kept straying to his holster. "All quiet. How are things in town?" Jimmy shifted his weight, trying to project authority, but coming across as nervous. Getting tense. "Those men at Rita's, they're making the rounds, talking to all the business owners. Sheriff's documenting everything, building a case. Building a case takes time," Marcus said, watching another black SUV cruise past on the highway. "Sometimes things happen fast." The deputy nodded, then hesitated. "Mr. Colby, some of the older folks in town, they talk about you sometime, about what you did in the war." Marcus turned back to his fence post. "War was a long time ago, son. I'm just a farmer now." Later that afternoon, Marcus drove into town for supplies. Main Street had changed since morning. People hurried along the sidewalks, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Outside Rita's diner, two men in expensive suits leaned against a black SUV, watching passers-by with predatory intent. Inside the hardware store, old Bill Thompson was arguing with his daughter Sarah about installing security camera. They fell silent when Marcus entered, but Sarah caught his arm as he passed. "Mr. Colby, you heard what happened at Rita's? They said if she doesn't pay by Friday, they'll show her what happens to people who don't appreciate their protection." Marcus selected the fence wire he needed. "Heard something about it. Someone needs to do something," Sarah insisted. "The police. They're good people, but they're outgunned. These men, they're not afraid of local cop. Best thing folks can do is stay calm," Marcus said, paying for his purchase. "Let the law handle it." As he drove home, Marcus spotted Deputy Chen's patrol car parked outside the gas station. Two men from the black SUV were standing over the young officer, who was sprawled on the ground, clutching his ribs. Blood trickled from his nose. Marcus kept driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. In his rear-view mirror, he watched one of the men deliver a final kick before they climbed back into their vehicle. That night, Marcus sat on his porch, cleaning his grandfather's old shotgun. The weapon was legally registered, ordinary, exactly what anyone would expect a Texas farmer to own. What no one knew about was the hidden compartment beneath his study floorboards, where other weapons slept beneath a layer of dust. The sound came just after midnight, breaking glass, followed by the whoosh of flame. Marcus was moving before his conscious mind registered what was happening. He grabbed the shotgun and ran toward the flagpole, where fire bloomed against the night sky. The flag burned, American stars and stripes turning to ash in the darkness. On his fence, painted in fresh red letters, a message gleamed. "No heroes here, old man. Stay quiet and stay alive." Marcus watched the flag burn, feeling something shift inside him. Not anger, exactly. Something colder, more familiar. The calculating precision that had kept him alive in Vietnam, that had helped him save 37 men when the odds said they should all have died. He walked back inside and knelt in his study, prying up the loose floorboard. The footlocker inside was covered in dust. The lock's combination came to his fingers without thought. 0 to 3, -1, -9, -6, -8. Inside lay his medals, his old maps, and a satellite phone that hadn't been used in decades. Marcus lifted the phone and dialed a number from memory. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Who the hell is this?" "Doc, it's Colby." A sharp intake of breath. "Staff Sergeant? Jesus Christ, it's been, what, 20 years? Time to repay Da Nang." Silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. When Doc spoke again, his voice had changed, shed decades to become the voice of a Marine corpsman who'd followed Marcus through hell. "What do you need? Remember our old unit's coordinates? Pass the word." Quietly. "Copy that, Staff Sergeant. We'll be there." Marcus ended the call and returned to his porch. In the distance, he could see the lights of town, where good people lay awake in fear. Above him, the charred flagpole stood as an accusation against the star-filled Texas sky. He'd spent 30 years trying to forget the man he'd been in Vietnam. Now that man was awakening, called back by the smell of smoke and the sound of breaking glass. Tomorrow, men would begin arriving in town, veterans, gray-haired and battle-scarred, carrying old deaths. They thought they were terrorizing a simple farmer. They didn't know they were awakening a ghost, summoning back to life a legend that had been sleeping beneath rows of Texas corn. Marcus Colby sat in the darkness, watching the horizon, and began to plan. The morning after the flag burning, Marcus drove into town early, parking his truck across from Rita's diner. The breakfast crowd was thin, nothing like the usual bustle. Through the windows, he could see Rita herself working the counter, her movements sharp with tension. Her teenage son Tommy bused tables with quick, nervous glances at the door. 2 black SUVs pulled up outside the diner. 4 men emerged, wearing expensive suits that couldn't quite hide the bulges of shoulder holsters. The leader, a tall man with a silver watch that caught the morning sun, walked into the diner like he owned it. His companions spread out, one staying by the door, while 2 others began approaching customers. Marcus watched as they worked their way through the diner. At each table, they spoke quietly, showing phones with photos that made people's faces go pale. The customers hurried out afterward, leaving cash and half-eaten meals behind. Soon only Rita, Tommy, and an elderly couple remained. Deputy Jimmy Chen's patrol car rolled past, slowing as he assessed the situation. Marcus could see the bruising on the young officer's face, even from across the street. Jimmy parked and stepped out, squaring his shoulders before walking toward the diner. The man by the door straightened. "Private property officer. Owners having a business meeting." Jimmy kept his voice steady. "Had some complaints about harassment. Need to check it out." Inside, Marcus could see Rita shaking her head frantically at Jimmy, trying to wave him off. The leader turned from the counter, his smile revealing perfect white teeth. "No harassment here, Deputy. Just discussing a business opportunity with the lovely Rita. My associates are simply providing security services to local establishments. Very reasonable rates." "We don't need your kind of security," Jimmy said, hand resting near his holster. The leader's smile vanished. His men moved to surround the deputy, cutting off his line of retreat. "You should have learned your lesson yesterday, boy. But maybe you need another demonstration." Marcus watched the first punch land, sending Jimmy stumbling backward. The elderly couple fled as the thugs began working the deputy over methodically. Rita screamed for them to stop, but Tommy held her back, terror evident on his face. The sound of fists meeting flesh carried clearly through the diner's windows. Marcus gripped his steering wheel, knuckles white. Every instinct honed in combat screamed at him to intervene, but he knew that showing his hands now would only get more people hurt. This wasn't the jungle. He couldn't solve this with quick violence and fade away into the trees. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they stopped. Jimmy lay curled on the diner's floor, blood seeping from his nose and split lip. The leader straightened his tie and turned back to Rita. "Friday, $20,000 cash. Consider this a demonstration of why you need our protection." They left Jimmy where he fell, climbing back into their SUVs and pulling away. Only then did Rita and Tommy rush to help the deputy. Other townspeople emerged from nearby shops, but no one quite met anyone else's eyes. Marcus started his truck and drove to the sheriff's office. David Martinez sat behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, face lined with frustration. "I understand the jurisdictional issue, but we need support now. They're escalating." "Yes, I'll hold again." He waved Marcus in, then slammed the phone down. "State police say they need more evidence. FBI says it's not their jurisdiction yet. DEA's focused on larger operations closer to the border." "They worked Jimmy over again," Marcus said. David's face darkened. "I know. Got 3 calls about it already. But until they actually use weapons or deal drugs in the open, everyone up the chain says my deputies should document and observe. Town's getting scared. Town should be scared. These aren't ordinary thugs. They've got backing all the way to Sinaloa. Every business they shake down, every person they intimidate, it's all going in my reports. But by the time the bureaucrats decide to act, they'll own this whole county." Marcus studied the map on David's wall, marking cartel movements over the past month. "Reports won't stop them from hurting people." "Don't," David said sharply. "I know that look, Marcus. I was in Iraq. Different war, same look. You start something with these people, they won't just come after you. They'll burn this whole town down to make an example." Marcus stood to leave. "Like I told Jimmy, I'm just a farmer." That afternoon, more black SUVs rolled into town. They parked outside businesses up and down Main Street. Men in suits delivered their message of protection and consequences. By sunset, the streets were nearly empty. Marcus drove home as darkness fell. He could see lights on in most houses, people hiding behind locked doors and drawn curtains. Fear had settled over the town like a heavy blanket. The charred flagpole stood as an accusation against the night sky. Marcus walked his property line, checking fence posts out of habit. His phone buzzed in his pocket. "We're coming in quiet," Doc said without preamble. "Small groups. Different routes. First wave arrives tomorrow night." "How many?" 20 confirmed so far. More when word spread. "These boys have been waiting for your call since Nam." Marcus thought of Jimmy Chen's beaten face, of Rita's terrified son. "Might not be enough. You got 37 of us out of that valley with nothing but a radio and brass balls. We trust your plan. Might not be the same man I was." Doc's laugh crackled through the phone. "Staff Sergeant, with respect, that's bull. We all tried to leave the war behind, but some things don't fade. Some debts don't expire." After hanging up, Marcus walked to his study. The footlocker lay open, metals gleaming dully in the lamplight. Beneath them, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the tools of his former trade. He ran his fingers over familiar shapes, muscle memory returning with each touch. A noise outside snapped him to attention. Car engine, multiple vehicles. Marcus moved to his window, staying in the shadows. 3 black SUVs pulled up to his fence line. Men emerged, carrying gas cans and what looked like Molotov cocktails. The leader from the diner stepped into the moonlight, lighted up. "Show the old man what happens when people don't learn their lesson." Marcus watched as they spread gasoline around the base of his fence post. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about sending a message to the entire town. If they could intimidate the quiet farmer on the outskirts, no one would dare resist. The first bottle arsed through the air, shattering against a fence post. Flames leaped up, hungry in the night. More bottles followed, creating a wall of fire along his property line. Marcus felt the familiar calm settling over him. Combat clarity pushing aside all uncertainty. He tried to stay out of it, tried to let the law work, but they'd brought the war to his door, and now they would learn why veterans still spoke his name in whispers. He reached for his phone one last time, sending a brief text to Doc. Timeline accelerated. "Come armed." The cartel members were laughing now, taking photos of their handiwork with their phone. They didn't notice the old farmer slipping into the darkness, moving with the silent precision that had kept him alive through countless nights in hostile territory. Tomorrow, his brothers would begin arriving. Tonight, Marcus Colby would remind these men that some legends never truly fade. They just sleep until they're needed again. Marcus watched the cartel members from the shadows of his barn, their laughter carrying across his burning fence line. The fire cast wild shadow, transforming his peaceful farmland into something that reminded him too much of distant battlefields. He counted 8 men total, all armed, all believing they were untouchable. Inside his house, the footlocker lay open in his study. Marcus had already made his decision when he sent that text to Doc, but now, watching these men desecrate his land, the last threads of hesitation burned away with his fence post. He moved through his house with practiced efficiency, collecting what he needed. His fingers found familiar shapes in the footlocker: a combat knife that had seen him through 3 tours, a set of night vision goggles that still worked, and an encrypted radio that hadn't been used in decades. At the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay his old service pistol, a M1911 that had never failed him. The weight of the weapon in his hand brought memories flooding back, not the sanitized version of events he'd let the town believe, but the raw truth of what he'd done in Vietnam, the impossible mission that had earned him his legend, and the cost that came with it. Marcus checked the pistol's action, muscle memory taking over. He'd maintained all his equipment meticulously over the years, never quite able to let go of the habits that had kept him alive. From another hidden compartment, he retrieved several magazines of ammunition. The cartel members were still outside, their phones lighting up their faces as they recorded their handiwork. Marcus moved to his kitchen, staying low and away from windows. He pulled out his own phone and dialed Doc. 8 of them burning my fence line. Christ, already? Nearest team is still 4 hours out. No time to wait. They're escalating faster than we planned. Doc's voice hardened. You're not going out there alone, Staff Sergeant. That's not the plan. Plans change, Doc. You taught me that. At least tell me you're calling the sheriff. Marcus watched another Molotov cocktail arc through the night. David's got 2 deputies and a town full of scared people to protect. This needs to end tonight before they hurt anyone else. Marcus, listen to me. You're not 25 anymore. Wait for backup. They brought the war to my home, Doc. Time they learned why that's a mistake. Before Doc could argue further, Marcus ended the call. He moved through his house one last time, checking equipment and mentally mapping position. The old training came back like it had never left. Combat awareness heightening his sense. Outside, one of the cartel members shouted in Spanish, pointing at something in the darkness. Marcus recognized the voice as belonging to the leader from the diner. Good. The man responsible for beating Deputy Chen was about to learn some hard lessons about underestimating old soldiers. Marcus slipped out his back door, using the fire's glare to mask his movement. The cartel members had spread out along his fence line, still filming and laughing. None of them were watching the shadows behind them. They'd come expecting to terrorize a helpless old farmer. They weren't prepared for what they'd awakened. The first man went down silently, Marcus's combat knife finding its mark with surgical precision. He caught the body before it could fall, laying it gently in the grass. The other cartel members never noticed, too focused on their phones and their fire. Marcus moved to his next target, decades of stealth training making him invisible in the darkness. The second man died as quietly as the first, still clutching his phone as Marcus lowered him to the ground. Now the odds were better, 6 against 1, and he had the element of surprise. More importantly, he had something these men couldn't understand: the muscle memory of countless night operations, the instincts honed in jungle warfare, and the cold determination of a Marine protecting his home. The leader was speaking into his phone now, recording some message about consequences and respect. Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. The man had no idea what real consequences felt like, but he was about to learn. A branch cracked under someone's foot, and one of the cartel members turned, finally sensing something wrong. His eyes widened as he saw Marcus emerging from the shadows, M1911 raised. The first shot took him in the chest. Before his body hit the ground, Marcus was already moving, years of training taking over. The remaining cartel members scrambled for their weapons, but they were too slow, too unprepared for serious resistance. Marcus's pistol barked twice more, each shot finding its mark. These weren't wild thugs with guns. These were trained cartel soldiers, but they'd never faced anyone like him. They were used to intimidating civilians, not fighting a force recon Marine on his own territory. The leader managed to draw his weapon, but Marcus was already inside his guard. The man's expensive suit offered no protection. As Marcus's knife found his kidney, he fell, gasping, his gun unfired. The last 2 cartel members broke and ran for their SUVs. Marcus's shots followed them, methodical and precise. They made it halfway before falling, their phones still recording as they hit the ground. Silence fell over the property, broken only by the crackling of the burning fence post. Marcus stood in the firelight, checking bodies and collecting weapons with mechanical efficiency. The entire engagement had lasted less than 2 minutes. He retrieved his phone and called Doc again. "It's done," he said simply. Doc's sharp intake of breath carried clearly. "All of them?" "All 8. Need cleanup here before morning." "Jesus Christ, Marcus. You couldn't wait 4 hours? Send word to the others. Tell them to come ready for war. Cartel's going to respond hard when they find out about this." Marcus ended the call and began dragging bodies away from the fire. His movements were precise, economical, showing no sign of his age. The Marcus Colby who tended corn and fixed fences had receded, replaced by the Marine who had become a legend in the jungles of Vietnam. He was still working when headlights appeared on the road. Marcus melted into the shadows, weapon ready, but it was Sheriff Martinez's cruiser that pulled up to his burning fence line. David stepped out, taking in the scene with a combat veteran's eye. "Got calls about gunshots and fires out here. Anything you want to tell me?" Marcus emerged from the darkness. "Had some trespassers. They won't be coming back." David walked to the scene, noting the bodies Marcus had arranged neatly behind the barn. "This is going to bring hell down on us, Marcus. Cartel doesn't forget things like this." "I know. Could have waited for backup. Could have let me handle it legally." Marcus checked his weapon, reloading with fresh magazine. "They beat your deputy twice. Threatened Rita and her boy. Burned my flag. Law wasn't moving fast enough." David holstered his weapon inside. "I'll call this in as a gang-related shooting. Unknown perpetrator. By the time the investigation gets moving, it'll be too late anyway." "Appreciate that. That phone call you made earlier, the one you've been waiting 30 years to make. Those men coming?" Marcus nodded. "First wave arrives in a few hours. More behind them." "Good," David said, surprising Marcus. "Because when the cartel finds out about this, they're going to send everything they have. This isn't Vietnam, Marcus. No jungle to hide in. No army backing us up." "Don't need a jungle, David. Just need men who remember how to fight." Marcus walked David back to his cruiser. The sheriff paused before getting in. "I'll do what I can to keep this quiet for a few hours. Give your people time to get here. But Marcus, when this breaks open, there's no going back. You understand that?" Marcus looked at his burning fence line, thinking of Jimmy Chen's beaten face, of Rita's terrified son, of all the people in town hiding behind locked doors. "Some things are worth fighting for, David. Some debts have to be paid." The sheriff drove away, leaving Marcus alone with the fire and the dead. He had work to do before his brothers arrived. The cartel had brought violence to his quiet town, thinking they'd found easy prey. Instead, they'd awakened something that had been sleeping for 30 years, something they weren't prepared to face. Marcus Colby walked back to his house, past the burning fence post that marked the beginning of a war. Behind him, the phones of dead cartel members continued recording, their screens reflecting the flames that would soon engulf the entire town in conflict. The sound of rotor blades filled Marcus's ears as he crouched in the dense Vietnamese jungle. Rain pounded against broad leaves, creating a constant drumming that almost masked the approaching helicopters. Around him, 37 Marines lay wounded or exhausted, their ammunition nearly spent after 3 days of constant combat. The year was 1968. And Staff Sergeant Marcus Colby had just received orders that would haunt him for the next 3 decades. His radio crackled with the voice of his commanding officer, telling him that extraction was impossible. The landing zone was too hot, enemy anti-aircraft fire too intense. They were being written off as combat losses. Marcus looked at the men around him. Doc Reynolds worked frantically to stabilize a wounded private who couldn't be more than 19. Sergeant Peterson maintained a steady rate of fire toward enemy positions with their last belt of M60 ammunition. These weren't just Marine, they were his brother. He keyed his radio, speaking clearly despite the chaos around them. "Sierra Actual, this is Sierra 3. Those coordinates you gave us? They're wrong. I'm looking at a clear LZ half a click east. No enemy present." Complete silence filled the radio channel. Everyone knew he was lying. The eastern approach was even more heavily defended than their current position. "Sierra 3, say again your last?" Marcus watched tracer fire arc through the rain-soaked sky. "Clear LZ to our east. I'll mark it with smoke. Bring in the birds and I'll have these men ready for extraction." More silent. Then, "Sierra 3, that's a negative. Intel shows heavy enemy presence in that sector." "Intel's wrong. Trust me, sir. I'm looking right at it." The pause that followed felt eternal. Marcus used the time to signal Peterson, sketching a quick plan in the mud. The sergeant's eyes widened as he understood, but he nodded grimly. Finally, the radio crackled. "Sierra 3, be advised. 2 Hueys inbound to your marked LZ in 10 minutes. This is against my direct recommendation." Marcus allowed himself a tight smile. "Roger that, Sierra Actual. 3 out." He gathered his remaining able-bodied men, explaining the plan quickly. They would split their forces. Marcus would lead a small team to the eastern sector, drawing enemy fire away from the real extraction point to the west. Peterson would get the wounded. "That's suicide, Staff Sergeant. They've got at least a company over there. Better me than all of us, Marcus said, checking his weapon. Besides, I've got a date next week. Can't miss it. The joke broke some of the tension, earning grim chuckles from his men. They all knew the odds. They'd been fighting the NVA for days, had seen their brutal efficiency. Drawing their fire meant certain death. Marcus selected 4 volunteers, each man meeting his eyes with quiet determination. They would follow him into hell because that's what Marines did. They looked after their own. The next 8 minutes passed in a blur of activity. Marcus's team moved east, setting up a series of charges they'd been saving for emergency. When the helicopters appeared on the horizon, they detonated them in sequence, creating the illusion of a major assault. The NVA responded exactly as Marcus had predicted, shifting their forces to meet the perceived threat. Heavy machine gun fire and mortars targeted his small team's position, while the real extraction proceeded smoothly to the west. Marcus and his men kept moving, using techniques they'd learned through hard experience. They fired from multiple positions, threw grenades to simulate a larger force, and managed to convince the enemy they faced a full company instead of 5 desperate Marines. The radio came alive with Peterson's voice. Sierra 3, packages are wrapped, birds are heavy. Marcus knew what that meant. All wounded were aboard. Now came the hard part. Copy that, Sierra 2. Good luck. He switched channels, calling the helicopter pilots directly. Dust off. This is Sierra 3. Be advised, LZ is closing. Get those birds out of here now. The pilot's response was immediate. Sierra 3, what about you and your team? We'll find another way out. Clear this airspace immediately. Marcus could hear the hesitation in the pilot's voice, but military discipline won out. The sound of rotor blades faded as the helicopters carried their precious cargo to safety. For the next 3 hours, Marcus led his small team in a fighting retreat through the jungle. They laid false trails, set booby traps, and used every trick they'd learned to stay alive. 2 men were hit, but kept moving, understanding that stopping meant death. Just before dawn, they reached the fallback position Marcus had identified earlier. A steep cliff overlooked a river swollen by monsoon rain. The NVA were closing in from 3 sides. Only one way out now, Marine, Marcus said, checking his last magazine. 3 rounds left. His men understood immediately. Without hesitation, they stepped off the cliff into the raging water below. The fall was dangerous, but it beat certain capture. The impact drove the air from Marcus's lungs. The current grabbed him, throwing him against rocks and submerged logs. He fought to stay conscious, knowing that if he passed out, he'd drown. Somehow, they all survived. The river deposited them 5 miles downstream, where a Marine patrol found them half drowned but alive. All 5 had made it, though each carried wounds that would leave permanent scars. Back at base, Marcus learned that all 37 Marines they'd saved had survived. His commanding officer recommended him for the Navy Cross, citing his exceptional leadership and courage under fire. The medal ceremony was a blur, overshadowed by the memory of what they'd endured. That night, Doc Reynolds came to his tent. The corpsman sat silent for a long moment before speaking. Those men you saved? They're calling you a legend already. The staff sergeant who told command to stick their orders where the sun doesn't shine and got everyone out alive. Marcus cleaned his rifle, the familiar routine helping to steady his hand. Just did what any Marine would do. No, Doc said firmly. What you did, that was something else. Those men will never forget it. They'll carry that debt until the day they die. Marcus looked up from his weapon. There's no debt, Doc. We're Marines. We look after our own. Doc stood to leave, but paused at the tent's entrance. You ever need anything, Staff Sergeant, you just have to ask. Any of it, any time. That's a promise. Now, 57 years later, Marcus stood in his Texas farmhouse, holding the same rifle he'd carried that day in Vietnam. The weapon had been modified, updated, but its core remained the same. Like him, the sound of vehicles approaching drew his attention, not the sleek SUVs of the cartel, but older trucks and cars, driven by men who understood the meaning of brotherhood. His phone buzzed with a text from Doc. First wave is here, Staff Sergeant, ready to repay that debt. Marcus walked to his front porch, watching as vehicles pulled up to his property. The men who emerged moved with the careful precision of combat veterans. Their hair might be gray, their steps slower, but their eyes held the same determination he remembered from that rain-soaked jungle. Doc Reynolds stepped forward, his medical bag slung over one shoulder just like in Vietnam. He'd updated his equipment over the years, but some things never changed. Reporting as ordered, Staff Sergeant, Doc said, his voice gruff with emotion. The others are coming, words spreading fast. Marcus nodded, noting how the veterans were already assessing the terrain, identifying defensive position. Some habits never died. Welcome home, Marines, he said simply. We've got work to do. The cartel had awakened something they couldn't understand. They'd brought violence to a peaceful town, thinking they faced simple farmers and shopkeepers. Instead, they'd stirred a brotherhood forged in combat, men who had never forgotten the debt they owed to the quiet farmer who had once defied death to bring them home. The veterans worked through the night, transforming Marcus's farm into a defensive position. They moved with practiced efficiency, decades of civilian life falling away as muscle memory took over. By dawn, they had established observation posts, communications networks, and fallback positions. Doc Reynolds set up a medical station in Marcus's barn, organizing supplies with the same precision he'd shown in Vietnam. His hands moved automatically as he arranged field dressings and emergency equipment, preparing for casualty they all knew would come. 8 more arrived during the night, Doc reported, checking his inventory. Peterson's group should be here by noon. That puts us at 23, with more coming. Marcus nodded, studying a map of the town spread across his kitchen table. The veterans had marked cartel position, noting patrol patterns and gathering points. Their experience showed in the detailed observations, the kind only combat veterans would think to make. Sheriff Martinez's cruiser pulled up just after sunrise. He stepped out slowly, taking in the changed atmosphere of the farm. Veterans moved with purpose, carrying equipment and weapons that hadn't seen use in decades, but had been meticulously maintained. Quite a reunion you've got here, David said, accepting a cup of coffee from Doc. Cartel's noticed. They're pulling people in from other territory. My sources say they're calling in professionals. Good, Marcus replied. Professionals might understand what they're walking into, might make them think twice. A pickup truck rumbled up the driveway, carrying 4 more veterans. Marcus recognized James Peterson, the sergeant who'd helped coordinate the extraction in Vietnam. His hair was white now, but he moved with the same purposeful grace. Staff Sergeant, Peterson said, snapping a crisp salute. Second squad, reporting for duty. The formality brought a slight smile to Marcus's face. Good to see you, Jim. Get your men settled. Doc's running operations from the barn. Peterson's group integrated smoothly with the others, falling into roles they'd performed decades ago. These men had spent their civilian lives as teachers, accountants, mechanics, but beneath those peaceful professions, they'd remained Marines. In town, tension built as residents noticed the steady influx of older men. The veterans arrived individually or in small groups, checking into motels or staying with sympathetic locals. They carried themselves differently than tourists, moved with too much awareness of their surroundings. Rita's diner became an unofficial gathering point. The veterans took their meals there, leaving generous tips and watching the street with careful eyes. Rita herself seemed to stand straighter, drawing courage from their presence. Deputy Chen visited the diner during his patrol, his bruises still visible but healing. He noticed how the veterans positioned themselves with clear lines of sight to all entrances, how they communicated with subtle gestures and nods. They're not just old Marines, are they? Jimmy asked Rita quietly. They're here for a reason. Rita wiped down the counter, speaking softly. Way I hear it, they all served with Mr. Colby in Vietnam. Man saved their lives during some big battle. Now they're paying back the debt. The cartel noticed too. Their black SUVs cruised past the diner more frequently, observing the veterans with growing unease. These weren't the scared townspeople they were used to intimidating. These men watched back with predatory calm. At the farm, Marcus and his officers planned. They marked staging areas, established communication protocols, and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Experience had taught them the value of power, Peterson said, studying the map. But they're used to fighting scared civilians or rival gangs. They've never faced anything like us. Doc Reynolds looked up from his medical supplies. We're not young anymore, Jim. Can't move like we used to. Don't need to, Marcus replied. We've got something better than youth. We've got experience, and we know this ground. The veterans had spent their civilian lives learning the town's layout. They knew every alley, every rooftop, every potential choke point. What looked like random placement of their forces actually created interlocking fields of fire and mutual support position. More veterans arrived throughout the day. Each brought specialized skills learned in Vietnam and honed over decades of civilian life. Former snipers set up observation posts in church steeples and water towers. Combat engineers identified defensive positions and potential ambush sites. The town's atmosphere changed subtly. Cartel members found their usual intimidation tactics less effective. Shop owners stood straighter, knowing that combat veterans sat quietly in their stores, watching and waiting. At the hardware store, Old Bill Thompson discussed inventory with 2 veterans who'd spent the war-clearing tunnels in Cu Chi. They bought specific supplies, items that could serve multiple purposes in urban combat. Sarah Thompson watched the interaction, understanding dawning in her eyes. These men weren't just random retirees, they were preparing for war. The cartel's response came late that afternoon. A convoy of SUVs rolled into town, carrying hard-faced men with military haircuts and professional gear. These weren't common thugs. These were cartel enforcers, trained by former Special Forces contractors. Marcus watched through binocular as the new arrivals established their own observation post. They moved with precision, showing training that set them apart from ordinary criminals. At least 30 professionals, Peterson reported, plus the local muscle they already had in place. They're setting up for something big. Marcus lowered his binoculars. Good. Means they're taking us seriously. Doc Reynolds checked his medical supplies again, an old habit from countless combat operations. You think they'll try to negotiate first? They'll try to show force, Marcus said. Intimidate us into backing down. When that fails, they'll move to eliminate what they see as the threat. The veterans understood. They'd seen this pattern before. In another war on another continent, the enemy would probe their defenses, looking for weakness. Finding none, they would commit to all-out assault. Sheriff Martinez visited again as darkness fell. His face showed the strain of trying to maintain order while two armed forces prepared for conflict in his town. Got word from higher up, David reported. State police are monitoring the situation, but won't intervene unless shots are fired. FBI is interested but says they need more evidence of cartel activity. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. By the time they decide to act, this will be over one way or another. The sheriff studied the veteran positions visible from the farm. These men, they understand what they're walking into? This isn't Vietnam. No medals waiting at the end of this fight. They understand better than the cartel does, Marcus replied. They're not here for medals. They're here because 30 years ago I refused to leave them behind. Now they're returning the favor. Night settled over the town, bringing an eerie calm. Veterans maintained their watch, communicating through hand signals and radio clicks, just as they had decades ago. The cartel enforcers did the same, professional soldiers recognizing professional soldiers across the divide. In his barn, Doc Reynolds finished organizing his medical station. Combat experience told him he'd need it soon. The cartel wouldn't accept the challenge to their authority. They would have to demonstrate their power, prove that age and experience meant nothing against modern weapons and trained killers. Marcus walked his perimeter one last time, checking positions and speaking quietly with his men. These veterans had spent decades in peaceful professions, raising families and building lives far from combat. But beneath their civilian exterior, they had remained Marines. The cartel had made a critical mistake. They thought they were facing a group of old men playing at war. They didn't understand that some skills never faded, some bonds never broke. They had awakened something that had been sleeping for 30 years, a brotherhood forged in combat and tempered by time. Tomorrow would bring violence to the quiet Texas town. But tonight, Marcus Colby stood among his brother, watching cartel vehicles patrol empty streets. The enemy was professional, well-armed, and confident in their power. They didn't know that confidence was their weakness. They hadn't learned what Marcus and his men had discovered in the jungles of Vietnam. True strength lay not in weapons or numbers, but in the unbreakable bonds between warriors who had faced death together and refused to let each other fall. The cartel made their first move at dawn. 3 black SUVs pulled up outside Rita's diner, disgorging 8 men in tactical gear. Their leader, a former Mexican Special Forces operator named Cruz, walked into the diner like he owned it. His men spread out, covering exits and windows with professional precision. Rita stood behind the counter, her hand steady as she poured coffee. 4 veterans sat at different tables, appearing to read newspapers or eat breakfast. Their relaxed postures masked combat-ready tension. Cruz approached the counter, his movements controlled and purposeful. You have new customers lately. Old men who think they're still soldiers. They need to leave. Rita met his gaze. Free country. Can't tell people where to eat. Cruz placed a phone on the counter, playing a video. It showed Marcus's property the night of the fence burning. 8 cartel soldiers dead, taken down with military precision. Your friend Colby killed my men, Cruz said softly. Now he brings more soldiers to my town. This is bad for business. Before Rita could respond, the diner's door opened. Deputy Chen walked in, uniform crisp despite his still healing bruises. He moved differently now, having learned from his previous encounter. Everything okay here, Rita? Jimmy asked, positioning himself with clear sight lines to Cruz's men. Cruz smiled. All teeth and no warmth. Just having breakfast, officer. Making sure everyone understands the new management. The veterans continued eating, but their postures had shifted subtly. Hands disappeared under tables or into jackets. Combat veterans recognizing the prelude to violence. The tension broke when Cruz's radio crackled. Rapid Spanish informed him of movement at Marcus's farm. The cartel commander stood, leaving cash on the counter. Tell Colby we're watching. Tell him smart soldiers know when to retreat. After they left, Rita let out a shaky breath. One of the veterans, a former sniper named Wilson, approached the counter. You did good, he said quietly, but you should close early today. Things are about to get complicated. At the farm, Marcus watched through binoculars. As cartel vehicles established surveillance position, they were professional, maintaining proper distance and communications protocols. Doc Reynolds joined him on the porch. They're probing our defenses, looking for weak points. Let them look, Marcus replied. Peterson's team ready? Doc nodded. In position since dawn. Cartel's got no idea how many men we actually have, or where they are. The veterans had spent the night transforming the town. Every cartel observation post was itself being observed. Every patrol route was mapped and timed. Decades of combat experience guided their preparation. The first shot came at noon. A cartel sniper set up in the abandoned grain silo took aim at what he thought was Marcus walking his property line. The bullet struck a carefully positioned dummy. Return fire came instantly. 3 veteran snipers, their positions unknown to the cartel, engaged the threat. The grain silo erupted in broken glass and splintered wood. Cruz's voice came over a loudspeaker, speaking perfect English. "Impressive shooting, old men. But this is your last warning. Leave town by sunset, or we burn everything." Marcus keyed his radio. "All units, maintain position. They'll test us first, see if we scare easy." The veterans acknowledged with clicks, preserving radio silence. They'd played this game before, in another war long ago. The cartel's next move targeted the town itself. Teams of enforcers visited businesses, smashing windows and overturning displays. They expected terror, compliance born of violence. Instead, they found resistance. At the hardware store, Bill Thompson stood his ground, backed by 2 veterans whose steady hands promised lethal consequences. The pharmacy owner, whose son had served in Iraq, refused to close his door. Each act of defiance was supported by hidden veterans, their presence felt but never seen. The cartel enforcers found themselves in an impossible situation, facing an enemy they couldn't properly target or engage. The confrontation exploded at 3 o'clock. A cartel team tried to force entry into Rita's diner, intending to make an example of her defiance. They breached the door with professional efficiency, only to find themselves facing 6 veterans who had anticipated exactly but intense. When silence fell, 4 cartel soldiers lay dead or wounded. The veterans had positioned themselves to minimize collateral damage, using angles and cover developed over decades of combat experience. Cruz responded immediately, mobilizing his full force. Black SUVs converged on the diner, disgorging heavily armed men. They established a perimeter, preparing for a full assault. Marcus watched through his binoculars as Sheriff Martinez arrived, lights flashing. The sheriff positioned his cruiser to block traffic, protecting civilians while officially maintaining distance from the conflict. "All units," Marcus said into his radio, "execute pattern Charlie." The veterans moved with coordinated precision. Teams that had been hidden in buildings emerged on rooftops. Others appeared in windows and doorways. In moments, the cartel forces found themselves surrounded, caught in interlocking fields of fire. Cruz recognized the trap, but couldn't retreat without losing face. He raised his rifle, targeting the nearest veteran position. The first shots came from multiple directions. Veterans who had spent decades in civilian life proved that some skills never faded. Their accuracy was devastating, their coordination flawless. Cartel enforcers dropped behind vehicles, returning fire with professional skill, but they were fighting an enemy they couldn't properly locate. Veterans who knew every angle and shadow of their town. Marcus led from the front, moving between positions with the same fluid grace that had made him a legend in Vietnam. His voice came calm and clear over the radio, directing teams and coordinating fire. The battle lasted 20 minutes. When silence fell, 9 cartel soldiers lay dead, with many more wounded. The veterans had suffered injuries, but no fatality, their preparation and experience proving decisive. Cruz knelt behind his SUV, bleeding from a shoulder wound. His remaining men looked to him for direction, their confidence shattered by the precision of the veteran response. Marcus's voice carried across the street. "Take your wounded and go. Tell your bosses this town is protected. Tell them what happens when they face real soldiers." The cartel commander stood slowly, professional enough to recognize defeat. "This isn't over, old man. The cartel doesn't forget. Neither do Marines," Marcus replied. "Remember that when you think about coming back." Doc Reynolds supervised treatment of the wounded, showing the same steady hands that had saved lives in Vietnam. Sheriff Martinez coordinated with state police, carefully framing the incident as a gang-related shootout. As cartel vehicles retreated from town, Marcus gathered his veterans. They had proved that age hadn't dulled their skills, that the bonds forged in combat remained unbreakable. Rita served coffee to the veterans, her diner's windows broken but her spirit unbroken. Deputy Chen helped tend the wounded, learning from men who had faced violence decades before. The town had changed. Its people stood straighter, no longer afraid. They had witnessed what happened when combat veterans stood together, when experience and brotherhood overcame mere force. Marcus watched the sun set over his farm, the burned fence line now a testament to the cost of underestimating old soldiers. His brothers had come when called, repaying a debt from another war in another time. The cartel had brought violence to a peaceful town, thinking they faced simple farmers and shopkeepers. Instead, they had awakened something they couldn't understand, a brotherhood forged in combat and strengthened by time. Tonight, The veterans would maintain their watches, ready for any response, but they had sent a clear message. Some debts never expire, some bonds never break, and some old soldiers never truly leave the battlefield behind. The cartel's retaliation came swiftly and brutally. 2 days after the battle at Rita's Diner, a specialized hit squad infiltrated the town under cover of darkness. Their target wasn't Marcus or his veterans, but the townspeople themselves. The first casualty was Tom Miller, the high school chemistry teacher who had been letting veterans use his garage as a staging area. They found his body in the school parking lot, a professional execution designed to send a message. Marcus received the news from Sheriff Martinez at dawn. Single shot to the head, David reported, his voice tight with controlled anger. They left a note pinned to his chest. Says, "For every cartel soldier we killed, they'll take 2 civilians." The veterans gathered in Marcus's barn, the mood grim. They had anticipated cartel violence, but not this targeted terror campaign against innocent people. Peterson laid out surveillance photos showing new cartel forces moving into position around town. "These aren't the same men we fought before. These are ghost teams, professional assassins. They're here to break the town's spirit." Doc Reynolds studied the medical report from Tom Miller's death. This was done by someone with military training, probably former special forces. They're escalating beyond normal cartel tactics. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Just like in Vietnam, his actions had drawn others into the conflict. The cartel was punishing the town for his defiance. The second attack came that afternoon. Sarah Thompson was closing the hardware store when 2 men in suits entered. The veterans positioned nearby couldn't react fast enough. By the time they reached her, Sarah lay bleeding on the floor. Doc worked frantically to save her, his combat medical experience proving crucial. "She'll live," he reported to Marcus. But they knew exactly what they were doing. Made it slow, made it hurt. The town's mood shifted from defiance to fear. Businesses closed early, streets emptied, and people huddled behind locked doors. The cartel's message was clear: support the veterans, die slowly. Marcus walked the empty streets, seeing shadows of Vietnam in every darkened window. He'd made the same calculations then, weighing the cost of action against inaction. But this time, the enemy wasn't fighting for territory or ideology. They were fighting for profit, fear. A call came from Rita's Diner. Her son Tommy had disappeared walking home from school. They found his backpack in an alley, along with another note. The cartel was targeting children now. The veterans reacted with cold fury. These men had spent decades building peaceful lives, raising families, and trying to forget the violence of their youth. The cartel had just made it personal. Marcus gathered his officers in the barn. "They think targeting civilians will make us back down. They don't understand what that does to old soldiers." Peterson nodded grimly. "In Vietnam, we protected villagers from exactly this kind of terror. Time to remember those skills." The veterans mobilized with deadly purpose. Teams deployed throughout town, establishing protection details for vulnerable civilians. Former reconnaissance specialists tracked cartel movement, identifying safe houses and staging areas. Marcus coordinated with Sheriff Martinez, sharing intelligence and resources. The sheriff's deputies worked alongside veterans, learning to spot cartel assassins and prevent attacks. But they couldn't be everywhere. The hit squad struck again at midnight, targeting the pharmacy owner's family. The veterans intercepted them this time, but the firefight left 2 former Marines wounded. Doc treated their injuries in his makeshift medical station. "These wounds are different," he reported. "They're using specialized ammunition, military-grade stuff. This isn't normal cartel equipment." Marcus studied the recovered round. The cartel had acquired serious hardware, possibly through former military contacts. They were committed to breaking the town through fear and precision violence. The veterans adapted their tactics. They began moving civilians to safe houses, using techniques learned protecting Vietnamese villages. Each family was assigned a protection detail, veterans sleeping in shifts to maintain constant surveillance. Rita refused to leave her diner, turning it into a fortified position. Veterans reinforced windows and established clear fields of fire. Her missing son Tommy was found alive but beaten. Another message from the cartel. The hit squad's leader made contact through Sheriff Martinez. He identified himself only as Ghost, a former Delta Force operator now working for the highest bidder. "Tell Colby we can do this forever," the message said. "Every day he stays, more civilians die. He knows the calculus of acceptable losses. Time to make the hard call." Marcus remembered similar choices in Vietnam. Villages burned because he chose one path over another. Men died because he had to prioritize objectives. But this was different. This was his home. The veterans gathered for a war council. Some argued for withdrawal, saying the cost to civilians was too high. Others wanted to take the fight directly to the cartel. Consequences be damned. Peterson voiced what many felt. "We've spent 30 years trying to forget what we were capable of in Vietnam. Maybe it's time to remember." Doc Reynolds cleaned his medical instruments, hands steady despite exhaustion. "Whatever we do, We need to do it soon. The town can't take much more. Opening the footlocker that held his Vietnam medals. Beneath them lay maps and documents. Intelligence gathered over decades of quiet preparation. The cartel had escalated beyond intimidation into terror. They thought targeting civilians would force the veterans to withdraw. Instead, they had awakened something darker. Skills learned in another war, where protecting the innocent meant becoming something monstrous. Marcus returned to the barn carrying his old maps. The veterans gathered around, recognizing the look in their commander's eyes. It was the same expression he'd worn in Vietnam, when impossible situations required impossible solution. They want to fight like ghosts, Marcus said, laying out detailed plans of the town. Let's show them what real ghosts can do. The veterans leaned in, combat instincts awakening. They had spent decades being peaceful men, but the cartel's brutality had forced their hands. Sometimes protecting the innocent meant embracing the darkness they had tried so hard to forget. Tomorrow would bring violence unlike anything the quiet Texas town had seen. The cartel thought they were fighting old soldiers playing at war. They were about to learn what happened when combat veterans stopped holding back, when the skills learned in Vietnam's darkest corners were unleashed. Marcus looked at his brothers, seeing the same cold determination in their eyes. The cartel had crossed a line, thinking civilian casualties would break their resolve. Instead, they had reminded old soldiers why they had become lethal in the first place. The town hall meeting was called at midnight, held in the basement of the old Methodist church. Marcus stood before the gathered civilian, his veterans positioned at every entrance. The townspeople's faces showed a mix of fear, anger, and desperate hope. Sheriff Martinez took the floor first, outlining the situation with brutal honesty. 4 civilians dead, 12 wounded, and the cartel's ghost teams still hunting for more targets. State police were overwhelmed. FBI task forces tied up with larger operation. Rita spoke next, her son Tommy beside her, his bruises still fresh. They think terrorizing us will make us turn against the veterans. They don't understand this town. Marcus stepped forward, his presence commanding attention despite his farmer's clothes. What I'm about to propose puts every one of you at risk. You deserve to make this choice knowingly. He laid out his plan with military precision. The veterans would take the fight directly to the cartel's leadership, not just their soldiers. But to do that, they needed the town's complete cooperation. Business owners would become intelligence gatherers. High school students would act as messengers. Every garage could become an arsenal, every basement a safe house. The entire town would transform into a battleground of their choosing. Sarah Thompson stood, her arm in a sling from the cartel attack. They already made this our fight when they started targeting children. Tell us what you need. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Marcus answered questions, addressed concerns, and made no promises he couldn't keep. When it ended, the town had chosen its path. By dawn, the transformation began. Veterans trained civilians in basic surveillance technique. Shop owners installed hidden cameras and communication systems. The high school woodshop became a weapons modification facility. The cartel's ghost teams noticed the change immediately. Their civilian targets suddenly became harder to track. Simple shopkeepers showed inexplicable awareness of surveillance. Every attempt to isolate targets met organized resistance. Ghost, the hit squad leader, sent another message through Sheriff Martinez. Impressive adaptation, Colby, but involving civilians makes them legitimate targets. Marcus's response was delivered by Deputy Chen. You already made them targets. Now they're choosing to be warrior. The veterans implemented techniques perfected in Vietnam, adapted for urban combat. They established a network of safe houses connected by hidden routes. Former tunnel rats taught civilians how to move unseen through their own town. Doc Reynolds expanded his medical operation, training local nurses in combat trauma care. His experience treating civilian casualties in Vietnam proved invaluable as he prepared the town for what was coming. The cartel escalated further, bringing in more professional killers. But each new team found themselves facing not just veterans, but an entire town organized for resistance. Simple targets had become hardcore fighters. Marcus coordinated from his farm, using skills honed over 3 tours in Vietnam. He could read the pattern of cartel movements, anticipate their tactics, and position his forces accordingly. Peterson's teams began striking back, targeting cartel surveillance positions and support infrastructure. Every attack was precise, designed to disrupt without civilian casualty. The ghost teams attempted another civilian assassination, targeting the high school principal. They found themselves facing not just veterans, but parents and teachers who had learned to fight back. The firefight spilled across the school parking lot, the same place where they had killed Tom Miller. This time, the cartel killers met organized resistance. Former soccer moms threw grenades with surprising accuracy. Shop owners provided covering fire from reinforced positions. When silence fell, 3 cartel assassins lay dead. The town had suffered wounds but no casualty. The veterans' training was transforming ordinary citizens into effective fighters. Ghost made one final attempt at negotiation, offering to withdraw his teams if Marcus and his veterans left town. The message came through Rita's diner, delivered by a cartel soldier who understood he was surrounded by armed civilians. Marcus's response was simple: the town is the target now. That means the town fights back. The cartel leadership received the message with cold fury. Orders came down to escalate beyond targeted killing. They would burn the entire town to make an example. But Marcus had anticipated this reaction. His veterans had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of threat. The town wasn't just their home, it was now their fortress. Sheriff Martinez coordinated with state authority, ensuring official responses would be delayed. The town needed time to implement Marcus's full plan. The veterans gathered at the farm for final preparation. These men had spent 30 years trying to forget the darkness they had embraced in Vietnam. Now they would use those skills one last time. Doc Reynolds prepared his medical supplies, knowing that before dawn, he would need every bit of his combat experience. The town's transformation from peaceful community to resistance force would be tested in fire. Marcus walked his property line, past the rebuilt fence that had started this war. The cartel had brought violence to his home, thinking they faced simple farmers and shopkeepers. Instead, they had created an army of civilians trained by combat veterans who remembered all too well how to fight brutality with brutality. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation. The cartel would learn too late that targeting civilians had only strengthened the town's resolve. Marcus looked at the stars, remembering similar nights in Vietnam when impossible odds required impossible courage. His radio crackled with reports from observation posts throughout town. Civilians and veterans working together, protecting their homes with a determination born of desperation and training. The cartel thought they were fighting old soldiers and scared townspeople. They were about to learn what happened when an entire community decided to become warriors. The battle began at midnight. Cartel forces struck simultaneously across town, expecting to overwhelm civilian resistance with synchronized violence. Their first target was Rita's diner, now a fortified command center for the southern sector of town. Ghost led the assault personally, deploying his best teams with professional precision. They breached the diner's entrance using shaped charges, prepared for the veterans they knew would be waiting inside. Instead, they found the building empty. As Ghost's teams moved to secure the interior, the trap was sprung. Civilians in adjacent buildings opened fire from concealed positions. Veterans coordinated the response, turning the diner's surroundings into a killing zone. Marcus observed through night vision optics from his position on the church roof. Peterson's voice came over the radio, reporting similar ambushes across town. The cartel forces had walked into carefully prepared defensive positions. Ghost recognized the trap too late. His teams were caught in interlocking fields of fire, facing opponents who knew every angle and shadow. Former soccer moms threw grenades from reinforced windows. Shop owners provided covering fire from hardened position. The cartel commander attempted to coordinate a fighting retreat, but found his communications jammed by equipment the veterans had prepared. Each team was isolated, forced to fight without support. Deputy Chen led a group of civilians who had trained for weeks for this moment. They moved through back alleys and service corridors, striking cartel forces from unexpected angles. Their lack of military experience was balanced by intimate knowledge of their medical response from his barn, coordinating civilian nurses and combat medic. They treated wounded from both sides with professional efficiency, skills honed in Vietnam now serving a new generation of fighters. The battle spread across town as cartel reinforcements arrived. They found their usual tactics useless against an enemy that mixed veteran experience with civilian determination. Every storefront concealed defenders. Every alley could become an ambush. Marcus coordinated the defense from multiple positions, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted. His veterans implemented plans practiced in Vietnam, adapted for urban combat. They used the town's infrastructure against the invaders, turning familiar streets into deadly ground. The high school became a focal point as Ghost attempted to establish a command center in its fortified gymnasium. But the building had been prepared for exactly this possibility. Teachers and students who had trained alongside veterans turned classrooms into strongpoint. Sarah Thompson, her arm still in a sling, directed civilian fighters from the school's security office. The cartel forces found themselves facing coordinated resistance from every direction. Football players threw incendiary devices with the same skill they once showed on the field. The fight for the school lasted 2 hours. When silence finally fell, Ghost's elite teams had been decimated. The former Delta operator himself was cornered in the cafeteria, surrounded by teachers who had learned to fight from Marcus's veterans. Across town, similar scenes played out. Cartel forces trained in military tactics found themselves outmaneuvered by civilians who had turned their own homes into fortresses. Veterans provided the expertise, but it was the townspeople who proved decisive. Marcus received constant updates from his observation network. Civilian spotters tracked cartel movements, coordinating with veteran teams to eliminate threats. The entire town had become a coordinated fighting force. The tide turned definitively when Peterson's teams seized the cartel's mobile command center. The professional soldiers found their communications compromised, their movements predicted, their tactics countered by opponents who mixed combat experience with local knowledge. By dawn, the remaining cartel forces were trapped in isolated pockets throughout town. Ghost made one final attempt to turn the battle, ordering his surviving teams to target civilian leaders directly, but the townspeople were no longer helpless victims. Rita coordinated the defense of her sector with cold efficiency, her diner's regular customers now hardened fighters. The hardware store had become a fortress, its staff executing combat maneuvers with practiced skill. Marcus moved between positions, directing the final phase of the battle. His veterans had trained these civilians well, turning shopkeepers and teachers into effective urban fighters. The cartel's professional killers found themselves facing an entire town that had learned to fight back. The last major engagement centered on the town square. Ghost's remaining forces attempted to break out using civilian hostages as shields. They found themselves confronted by parents and neighbors who had overcome their fear of violence. Deputy Chen led the final assault, coordinating police and civilian fighters with veteran guidance. The young officer had learned well from Marcus's men, turning his previous defeats into tactical advantages. When the shooting stopped, the town square was secured. Ghost and his surviving operators surrendered to armed civilians who had once been their intended victims. The cartel's attempt to break the town through terror had accomplished the opposite. Doc Reynolds treated the wounded, assisted by nurses who had learned combat medicine from his experiences in Vietnam. The town had suffered casualties, but its spirit remained unbroken. If anything, the fight had strengthened their resolve. Marcus surveyed the aftermath from his original position on the church roof. The town showed signs of battle, but its people moved with new confidence. Veterans and civilians worked together to secure position and treat casualties, their coordination showing weeks of training paying off. Sheriff Martinez coordinated with state authority, managing the official response to what would be recorded as a major gang conflict. The truth of how an entire town had transformed into a resistance force would remain known only to those who had lived it. The cartel's leadership received the message clearly. Their attempt to break the town through professional violence had been met with something they couldn't counter: the combined might of combat veterans training civilians to defend their home. Ghost, sitting handcuffed in Rita's diner, spoke quietly to Marcus. "You turned an entire town into fighters. That wasn't just veteran experience, that was something else." Marcus looked at the civilians moving purposefully through their street, helping wounded and securing positions. They were always fighters. They just needed to remember it. The sun rose over a changed town. Buildings showed battle damage, but the people moving through the streets were different. They had faced professional killers and emerged victorious, guided by veterans who remembered all too well how to resist terror with coordinated force. Doc Reynolds supervised the final casualty count, his expression grim but satisfied. The town had paid a price, but they had protected their own. Just like in Vietnam, the difference between victory and defeat came down to ordinary people choosing to become warriors. The cartel's main force arrived as the sun reached its peak, 50 vehicles strong. They rolled into town with overwhelming firepower. Their leader, a man known only as El Coyote, had built his reputation on crushing resistance through sheer force. Marcus watched from his sniper position as cartel soldiers deployed with military precision. These weren't the professional killers they'd faced before. These were hardened combat units, equipped with modern weapons and body armor. "I count 200 plus, Peterson reported over the radio. "Heavy weapons, tactical gear. They're not here to intimidate anyone." El Coyote's voice boomed through vehicle-mounted speakers. "You have 1 hour to surrender Colby and his veterans. Comply, and civilians will be spared. Resist, and we burn everything." The town's response came from multiple positions. Civilians and veterans had prepared for this moment, turning every street into a defensive line. The cartel forces found themselves facing an enemy that combined combat experience with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Deputy Chen coordinated police response from his position near the school. The young officer had learned well from Marcus's veteran, transforming from a beaten rookie into a capable combat leader. The first exchange began when cartel forces attempted to secure the town square. They moved in textbook formation, expecting minimal resistance. Instead, they met coordinated fire from multiple angles. Marcus directed the defense from his elevated position, using skills honed over 3 tours in Vietnam. His veterans implemented pre-planned responses, guiding civilian fighters with practiced efficiency. Rita's diner had become a fortress, its windows reinforced and its kitchen converted to a medical station. Doc Reynolds worked alongside civilian nurses, preparing for casualties they knew would come. El Coyote ordered his forces to advance block by block, using armored vehicles as cover, but the town's defenders had prepared for these tactics. Veterans had trained civilians in the art of urban combat, turning familiar streets into deadly ground. The hardware store became a focal point as cartel forces attempted to establish a command center. Sarah Thompson, her previous wounds still healing, directed the defense with cold precision. Her father's regular customers had become hardened fighters. Marcus shifted his position as the battle intensified, moving through hidden routes between buildings. His radio carried constant updates from observation posts throughout town. Civilian spotters tracked cartel movements, coordinating with veteran teams. The fighting reached its peak at the high school. El Coyote committed his reserve forces, attempting to break the town's resistance through sheer numbers. The school's defenders, a mix of teachers, students, and veterans, turned every classroom into a strongpoint. Doc Reynolds received wounded at his medical station, treating civilians and veterans with the same steady hands that had saved lives in Vietnam. The town's casualties mounted, but their resolve remained unbroken. Peterson led a counterattack from the church, his civilian fighters executing combat maneuvers with practiced skill. They forced the cartel forces to commit resources, disrupting their coordinated advance. El Coyote recognized the tactical situation deteriorating. His forces held superior numbers and firepower, but they faced an enemy that turned every street corner into an ambush site. Marcus coordinated the final phase from his original position. The town's defenders had drawn the cartel forces into prepared killing zone. Veterans and civilians worked together, their weeks of training paying off in coordinated resistance. The battle's turning point came when Deputy Chen led a flanking maneuver through the alleys behind Main Street. His team, composed of police officers and armed civilians, struck the cartel's command vehicles with isolate as his forces fractured under pressure. The cartel leader had built his reputation on breaking resistance through brutality, but he had never faced an entire town transformed into a coordinated fighting force. The final confrontation occurred in the town square, where it had all begun. Marcus descended from his position, moving through streets now secured by civilian fighters. El Coyote stood surrounded, his forces defeated by the combined might of veterans and townsmen. As the shooting stopped, Doc Reynolds directed medical response teams throughout town. The casualties were significant, but the town had protected its own. Just as in Vietnam, victory came from ordinary people choosing to become warriors. Sheriff Martinez coordinated with state authorities, managing the official narrative of what would be recorded as a major gang conflict. The truth of how veterans had trained civilians to resist professional killers would remain known only to those who lived it. El Coyote, secured in Rita's diner, spoke quietly to Marcus. "You did the impossible. You turned farmers and shopkeepers into soldiers." Marcus looked at the civilians moving purposefully through their streets, securing positions and treating wounded. They were always fighters. They just needed someone to show them how. The sun set on a changed town. Buildings showed the scars of combat, but the people walking the streets were different. They had faced overwhelming force and emerged victorious, guided by veterans who remembered how to resist terror with coordinated strength. Doc Reynolds completed his final casualty count, his expression grim but proud. The town had paid a heavy price, but they had protected their community. The difference between defeat and victory had come down to ordinary people choosing to become extraordinary. Marcus stood on his porch, watching vehicles carry wounded to nearby hospitals. The cartel had brought overwhelming force to crush resistance. Instead, they had learned what happened when combat veterans trained civilians to defend their home. The town would rebuild, its spirit strengthened by shared sacrifice. Veterans and civilians had fought together, transforming a quiet Texas community into something the cartel never expected, a force that combined military experience with unwavering determination to protect their own. The morning after the battle dawned quiet over the Texas town. National Guard vehicles lined Main Street, their presence a formality now that the fighting had ended. Marcus walked among the cleanup crews, noting how civilians and veterans worked together with practiced coordination. Doc Reynolds supervised the final evacuation of wounded to regional hospital. His makeshift medical station in the barn had treated over 60 casualties during the battle. 4 civilians had died defending their town, along with 2 veterans who'd answered Marcus's call. Sheriff Martinez managed the official response, coordinating with state authorities to document what would be recorded as a major gang conflict. The true story of how veterans had trained an entire town to resist cartel forces would remain untold. Rita reopened her diner, serving coffee to exhausted fighters and National Guard troops alike. The building's walls showed bullet holes and blast damage, but her resolve remained unbroken. Her son Tommy worked alongside her, his previous injuries now badges images of pride. Sarah Thompson directed repairs at the hardware store, organizing supplies for reconstruction with the same efficiency she'd shown during combat. Her father's regular customers had transformed from peaceful shopkeepers into hardened fighters, and that change showed in their movements. Deputy Chen supervised security alongside veteran teams, his previous inexperience replaced by combat-tested confidence. The young officer had learned well from Marcus's men, turning his earlier defeats into valuable lessons. The town gathered at noon for a memorial service. 4 flag-draped coffins held the civilian casualties. Tom Miller, the chemistry teacher who'd first supported the veteran; Maria Sanchez, a nurse who died treating wounded under fire; James Wilson, the elderly librarian who'd coordinated communication; and Karen Chen, Deputy Chen's sister, killed protecting evacuating civilians. 2 more coffins contained veterans: Michael Peterson, who'd served with Marcus in Vietnam, and Robert Taylor, a former Marine who'd arrived on the first day. They had died, as they had lived, protecting others. Marcus stood before the gathered town, his farmer's clothes replaced by his dress uniform. 30 years of peaceful life had ended when the cartel brought violence to his home. Now he faced the cost of resistance. These 6 people chose to fight when they could have fled, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. They died protecting not just their homes, but the idea that ordinary people can resist terror, that together, we are stronger than any force that tries to break us through fear. Doc Reynolds read the names of the wounded, a list that included veterans and civilians alike. Each name represented someone who had chosen to stand against overwhelming odds, guided by combat veterans who remembered all too well the price of freedom. The town had changed fundamentally. Shop owners who had once feared cartel intimidation now moved with warriors' confidence. Teachers who had never held weapons had become proficient fighters. Parents had transformed into tactical leaders, protecting their community with coordinated strength. Sheriff Martinez presented medals to the families of the fallen, his official citations masking the true nature of their sacrifice. The town's resistance would be recorded as a spontaneous uprising against gang violence, the role of Vietnam veterans carefully omitted from formal records. Rita hosted the memorial reception in her rebuilt diner. Veterans and civilians shared meals and memories, their bonds forged in combat now strengthened by shared loss. The cartel had sought to break the town through terror. Instead, they had created an unshakable unity. Sarah Thompson unveiled plans for a memorial wall, listing not just the dead, but every person who had fought to protect their community. The hardware store would become a testament to ordinary people choosing to become extraordinary. Deputy Chen spoke about his sister, his voice steady despite his grief. Karen had died, ensuring children reached safety during the final battle. Her sacrifice embodied the spirit that had transformed peaceful citizens into determined fighters. Marcus walked the town streets as evening fell, noting how people moved differently now. They had faced professional killers and emerged victorious, guided by veterans who remembered how to resist terror with coordinated force. Doc Reynolds supervised the conversion of his barn back into a normal structure, but certain modifications remained. The town had learned the value of preparation, of maintaining readiness even in times of peace. The National Guard commander met with Marcus to discuss official reports. The veteran presence would be minimized, the town's resistance attributed to local law enforcement and civilian courage. Some stories were better left untold. Peterson's widow arrived from Minnesota, her grief tempered by pride in her husband's final act. The veteran had died protecting the school, ensuring children had time to reach safety. His sacrifice represented the best traditions of the Marine Corps. The town council convened an emergency session, passing measures to maintain their newfound capabilities. Veterans would continue training civilians in defensive tactics, preparing for any future threats to their community. Marcus returned to his farm as darkness fell, surveying the damaged fence line that had started this conflict. The cartel had brought violence to his peaceful home, thinking they faced simple farmers and shopkeepers. They had learned too late what happened when combat veterans trained civilians to resist terror. Doc Reynolds joined him on the porch, sharing coffee and silence. Both men had seen too many deaths in Vietnam, had spent decades trying to forget the cost of violence. Now they faced those memories again, but this time, in defense of their own community. The town would rebuild, its spirit strengthened by shared sacrifice. Veterans and civilians had fought together, transforming a quiet Texas community into something the cartel never expected. A force that combined military experience with unwavering determination. Tomorrow would bring more cleanup, more healing, more adaptation to their new reality. But tonight, Marcus Colby watched the stars over his farm, remembering the men he'd lost in 2 different wars. Some fights were worth the cost. Some causes justified the sacrifice. The cartel had sought to rule through fear and found themselves defeated by courage. They had tried to break a town through terror and instead created warriors. Most important, they had learned that some bonds never break, some debts never expire, and some old soldiers never truly leave the battlefield behind. 1 month after the battle, Marcus stood before a new flagpole on his property. The morning sun caught the metal as he raised the American flag, its colors bright against the Texas sky. Veterans and townspeople gathered for the ceremony, their postures reflecting their transformed nature. Rita served coffee from a portable station, her diner still undergoing final repairs. Tommy worked alongside her, his movements showing the confidence gained from combat. The cartel's attempt to break them through terror had created something stronger, a habit he'd never lost from Vietnam. The barn behind him had returned to its normal function, but hidden preparations remained. The town had learned the value of readiness. Deputy Chen directed traffic around the gathering, his previous uncertainty replaced by earned authority. The young officer had absorbed lessons from the veterans, turning defeat into victory. His sister's sacrifice remained fresh in memory, driving him to maintain the town's newfound strength. Sarah Thompson arrived with her father, both moving with the practiced awareness of trained fighters. The hardware store had become a community center, its basement still configured for defense. Some changes were permanent. Sheriff Martinez represented the official presence, his reports carefully omitting the true extent of veteran involvement. The town's resistance would be recorded as a spontaneous civilian uprising, the role of Vietnam veterans preserved only in memory. Marcus addressed the gathered crowd, his farmer's clothes contrasting with his military bearing. 1 month ago, terror came to our town. They thought we would break. Instead, we became stronger. This flag flies not just for those we lost, but for what we gained. The knowledge that together, we can face any threat. The veterans who had answered his call were departing gradually, returning to peaceful lives across the country. But some chose to stay, purchasing homes and businesses in the town they had helped defend. Their presence ensured the community would never again be seen as an easy target. Rita's Diner became a gathering point for these new residents. Former Marines and Army veterans integrated into the community, their experience blending with civilian determination. The cartel had created something they never intended, a town that combined military precision with unwavering resolve. Doc Reynolds established a permanent medical training program, teaching combat care techniques to local nurses. The hospital incorporated lessons learned during the battle, preparing for future emergencies while hoping they never came. Sarah Thompson expanded the hardware store's inventory to include specialized equipment, recognizing the town's new requirement. Regular customers now understood both peaceful and tactical applications of tools, their knowledge shaped by combat experience. Deputy Chen led joint training sessions between police and civilians, maintaining the coordination that had proved crucial during the fight. His department implemented veteran-taught techniques, blending law enforcement with community defense. The memorial wall behind the town hall listed all who had fought, both living and dead. 6 names stood in gold, the fallen who had given everything to protect their community. Their sacrifice reminded everyone that freedom required constant vigilance. Marcus walked his property line each morning, checking defenses that remained subtle but effective. The rebuilt fence stood stronger than before, a symbol of resilience rather than vulnerability. His quiet farm had become a symbol of resistance against terror. The veterans who stayed purchased strategic properties throughout town. A former sniper bought the grain elevator. A combat engineer took over the auto repair shop. A reconnaissance specialist opened a sporting goods store. Each location doubled as a defensive position. Rita expanded her diner's basement, creating a secure meeting space for community planning. The booth where cartel enforcers had once threatened now belonged to veterans who ensured such intimidation would never return. The high school added a specialized curriculum, veterans teaching practical defense alongside standard subjects. Students learned history from men who had lived it, understanding that ordinary people could resist extraordinary threats. Marcus received updates from across the country as his former brothers settled into new lives. Each carried the memory of their stand against terror, knowing they had helped transform a peaceful town into something unique, a community that combined civilian values with warrior resolve. Doc Reynolds maintained contact with medical facilities across the region, establishing a network for emergency response. The town's preparations remained invisible to casual observers, but ready for activation if needed. Sheriff Martinez coordinated with state authority, managing official inquiries while protecting the town's secrets. The true story of veteran-led resistance remained known only to those who had lived it, preserved in memory rather than records. The town council passed measures supporting their new reality, funding training and equipment through carefully worded proposals. The community's transformation from peaceful citizens to coordinated defenders became permanent but subtle. Marcus watched the flag ripple in the morning breeze, remembering similar moments in Vietnam. The cartel had brought violence to his peaceful home, thinking they faced simple farmers and shopkeepers. They had learned too late what happened when combat veterans trained civilians to resist terror. Tomorrow would bring more integration, more preparation, more quiet strengthening of community bonds. But today, Marcus Colby stood among his brothers and neighbors, watching a new flag rise over a transformed town. The cartel had sought to rule through fear and found themselves defeated by courage. They had tried to break a community through terror and instead created warriors. Most importantly, they had learned that some bonds never break, some debts never expire, and some old soldiers never truly leave the battlefield behind. Sheriff Martinez approached Marcus as the crowd dispersed, speaking quietly. "Got word from Border Patrol. Cartels keeping their distance. Stories spreading about the town that fought back." Marcus nodded, understanding the message. Their resistance had created something beyond victory, a legacy of strength, a testament to what happened when veterans and civilians stood together against terror. The flag caught the sunlight, its colors bright against the Texas sky. Below it, a transformed community went about their daily lives, carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of people who had faced violence and emerged stronger. Marcus returned to his farm work, the familiar rhythm of peaceful life enhanced rather than disrupted by newfound vigilance. The quiet farmer remained, but now everyone understood what lay beneath the surface. A warrior who had reminded an entire town of their own strength.